Good morning, everyone. This is M.R. Rangaswamy with Indiaspora. Welcome to the Indiaspora Member Salon with Vinod Khosla. Again, the format is pretty typical. We've had previous salons with Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, Geeta Gopinath, the IMF Chief Economist, and more recently with Deepak and Mallika Chopra. So this is the continuing series that we're putting together in these tough times. I will start again, as usual, by asking Vinod a few questions, and then we'll open it up to everyone. You can ask questions by using either the chat box on Zoom or raising your hand. As everyone knows, Vinod is a legendary entrepreneur, investor, and technologist. He got his education at IIT Delhi, came over to Carnegie Mellon, and then went to Stanford Business School. He was a founder of Sun Microsystem and its CEO. He then joined high-profile venture firm Kleiner Perkins, where he funded groundbreaking companies like Juniper, Cerent, Excite, and many, many more. In 2004, he formed his own firm, Khosla Ventures, where he now manages over $1 billion, including a lot of his own money. I guess Vinod puts his money where his mouth is. Vinod and I, little known fact, are the same age, and our birthdays are just a few days apart, but I won't give the year or the month away. So Vinod, welcome to you. Hi, Vinod, can you hear me? Hello, Vinod. Can you unmute him, please? Yeah, hi, Vinod, welcome. Let's get right to it. What's in your mind these days? You know, everybody's talking about BLM. You've personally called out Tim Cook to take action. Where are you personally in this regard?
Well, my view is you should say what you mean. I'm probably a little too blunt in how I speak about things. Look, this is a hard issue, but we can't dance around it. It's very, very clear that we've had this problem brewing. And when you read the literature, you realize how complicit all of us are in racism. So many years ago, I'd read a book called Whistling Vivaldi about this issue and how we have inherent biases. But it's much more than that. Recently, I read a book called Anti-Racist, which argues that if you're not anti-racist proactively, you are in fact racist. When you do the small things we all tend to do to sort of prove to ourselves we are not racist, we are in fact being racist. So first, being conscious of what all the biases inherent in us is very, very important. And then being very proactive about what you do. Now, there's various levels at which we can do it. Protests are really valuable in awakening our consciousness to these issues. I'm generally in favor of those. I'm in favor of things like kneeling. But what bothers me is when people, and in the Trump thing, what really concerned me was they had a great employee memo, but Apple's still sucking up to Trump to get tariff relief. And those are hard trade-offs, I realize, and that's what prompted that particular comment. Like, you know, you can't do business. I'm always amazed at the number of people who will show up in Saudi Arabia at the PIF summits, those kinds of things. So one has to be proactively against things one doesn't believe in, not just passive about it or quiet about it. In the US, there's long-term things one can do. And the world is getting more polarized in the US, or the US is getting more polarized. Yrsa Klein has just written a really good book called Why We Are Polarized. Larry Lustig has written a great book, all of which I've read in the last few months. So I think it's pretty important to get what we call voting up to snuff. Vote by home is probably far more important than this election, though this election is absolutely critical. Because vote by home, vote from home, or giving people equal access to voting and making it easy to vote is structurally important over the long term. And so, in fact, that's an area we've been doing some work in supporting people, supporting the efforts in that area. Because if the right people vote and they don't feel disenfranchised that like they do today. There's a more important aspect, which is sort of the relevance to India. I've long felt India's powder keg will be the Muslim minority population and not having the same standard of living beyond just treating them equally or what we think is equal, not having the same standard of living in that community as you do in the rest of the population. I think that's a problem waiting to happen. If you look at the US, why are Indians not really considered a minority? It's because their income level is far higher than that of the white population, twice as high. And so it is about letting people feel empowered. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this question, but a wide range of thoughts there.
No, absolutely. No, thank you for your answering that and bringing some focus to it. But it's a burning topic. And like I said, told you earlier, Indiaspora will be gathering a group of Indian American venture capitalists to be more proactive in that area in terms of how we work as well. So let's quickly go through a background for our members. It's
interesting. One comment as we look at our own portfolio.
Yeah.
Women are reasonably represented in our portfolio, but minorities are not. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I've been surprised as I look back. Obviously, we have a lot of minority leaders. Ryan Cordray has been front and center on this BLM issue. We have a whole number of others, but for whatever reason, women have done better, not good enough, but better than the other minorities. So it probably needs more attention from us.
Great. Thanks, Vinod. I just wanted to quickly go through a little bit of your background to give our members some context. I know you grew up in Delhi. You came here, you founded Sun Microsystems along with Scott, had a stint there. And then you moved over to the venture capital side to Kleiner, and then to you're founding your own firm. Can you just quickly take us through that journey, just what your thoughts were being, a startup entrepreneur to a venture capitalist and then running your own firm?
Well, so let me give, you started with not saying what your age is. I'll disclose mine. I'm 65. And I have a 20-year plan on what I want to work on if health permits. I sort of am one of those people who believes you go old when you retire, you don't retire when you grow old. I literally wrote a 50-page document on what I want to work on after I turned 60. So I'm pretty proactive. But I had that when I was very young too. And there's a message in this that I'll come back to. Growing up at IIT, I fell in love with the idea that a Hungarian immigrant, Andy Grove, could move to the US and start a company in deep technology at the pinnacle of expertise. And that always became a passion for me, a vision for myself when I eventually did that. But there's another aspect to it that many of us forget. An important aspect to that is when you change what you're doing often enough, you learn a lot more. So breadth counts more than depth. I was the electrical engineer. When I was finishing up IIT, I worked with two of my friends to actually, we started the first biomedical engineering program at any IIT or any institution in India. We were very young, but we started that with Professor Guha at IIT. I tried to do a startup also in India. That didn't work very well because you couldn't even get a phone line. But we started the biomedical engineering program. I next did biomedical engineering at Carnegie Mellon in graduate school, and then went on to come to Silicon Valley, which was really my goal. But I never again worked in either electrical engineering or biomedical engineering. My first startup was a CAD startup, Daisy Systems, then the computer business. And then I worked in every area from digital media to chips to telecom. I did a lot, now doing a lot in climate and climate technologies. My point is, when you move across areas, your learning really accelerates, and not enough people do that. We have traditional notions of expertise and deep expertise. So having said that, I always did what was really interesting and what I was passionate about. So I first moved into CAD at Daisy Systems, which was my first startup, very successful, actually went public. Unfortunately, it wasn't as successful as Sun, so nobody remembers that. And nobody remembers the other startup I did that I failed at. But highly recommended. So I moved from venture after I finished 2 startups in a row. I actually wanted to do something completely different. Design was my real passion at that point, not technology. So I was, Kleiner Perkins was an investor in Sun. John Doerr was on my board. So I decided to work with them part-time, never intending to make it full-time. I was hoping to become a designer or an architect or something, but that became my hobby, and venture capital became my full-time job, mostly because I love mentoring young entrepreneurs.
Oh, that's great. So I think, by the way, Vinod, I'm 65 as well. So I was just kidding you earlier. But I need to, based on
I like to say I'm as far from retirement as my dad was when he was 33.
Yeah.
He was in the Indian Army, he retired at 53. I'm as far from retirement as my dad was at 33.
Yeah.
It's
couldn't
how
agree
you
with you
frame
more.
the question that matters a lot.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I do need to do that 20-year plan. You gave me an idea today. But going on with that, I know when you study a new area, for example, when you started studying climate technologies and stuff, you usually immerse yourself in that. Can you take us through that process? Because learning something new is not easy. So how do you put yourself into reading, writing, investigating? Can you kind of talk about that process?
Well, it's actually much easier than people think. I think people are afraid to do it. People don't have self-confidence, but it's not that hard. You just start reading, doing little things, learning. And there's a huge advantage if you're going after a new area. And the advantage is you don't have a lot of experience, which is mostly a set of biases. So I always view experience as a bias and not always a good thing. So if you're trying to look at the world fresh, you really want to not start with a set of biases or assumptions. And people who are in an area for 30 years always have too many biases. So my view is you start reading, you start learning, you start going deeper, then you formulate your thoughts. So in the in the first decade of this century, sort of from, I'll give you a little bit of story. Sarah and Juniper all were very, very successful by the year 2000. So I started looking at what should I work on next. And I spent a lot of time with Professor Yunus in Bangladesh and in villages in India, in the microfinance organizations in rural India. Me and my wife actually traveled there and spent time and decided I wanted to work on one of two things. One was either poverty or climate. Climate was easier to do because I had younger kids still at home. I could do it from the Bay Area and didn't want to disrupt their lives. But I did do a fair amount of work in microfinance back then. And I'll come back to this issue. But decide to work on climate and take a radical approach to climate, very different from what others were doing. I still remember speaking out against hydrogen as the fuel for cars. In fact, Governor Schwarzenegger then sent somebody to talk to me about not dissing hydrogen as a fuel for cars. Because if you do a grounds up analysis, you just couldn't see how it would work. There are people still working on it, and maybe at some point in the future it will work, but it makes no sense today. So I just start from the ground up. I have a lot of papers from 2006, 2007, but the key was you start small. You start with a lot of experiments. You don't learn by taking conventional views. I've never taken a McKinsey report and said, this is what I believe in. Always start from fundamental first principle thinking, which those of us who are engineers were taught to do from day one in our lives. And you can do that in any area. So I did that with climate. We did quite a few things, and you come up with unusual answers. I'll give you my favorite example. 10 years ago, we invested in plant protein and impossible foods. It was one professor from Stanford. Unusual place, very unusual area to take a genomics professor to work on chemistry of hamburgers. And it didn't scare us that it sounded unusual. Other VCs would laugh at you investing in hamburgers as a technology play. We looked at the fundamentals, and it was a very large part of greenhouse emissions and one of the fastest growing categories because red meat was growing. So we said, what can we do about it? And with that very fundamental thing, it came out of our sustainability effort around climate. And I think today we've changed the world's view of the role plant proteins may play in climate change. And by the way, it's probably bigger than agriculture is bigger than the cars in climate emissions or carbon emissions. So people don't realize that, but when you start looking at things fundamentally, you come up with very different answers. Very similarly, around the same time, I started looking at medicine. And I was really looking at medicine strictly from, as you know, my wife works in nonprofit education.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could do something in medical services on a nonprofit basis. And I realized that doctors actually didn't do medicine science, they did practice. I'm sure there's a few doctors in this audience. So in 2011, I wrote it in 2011. I think I published it the first week of January 2012 in TechCrunch. I wrote a blog called Do We Need Doctors? Because it was clear to me from first principle that if you wanted to drop the cost of medicine by 10x and improve the quality by 10x, the only way to do it was to eliminate humans in that loop. And it would take 25, 30 years. I actually did a calculation around how many medical schools one would have to start in India to get to the same doctor-patient ratio in India as you had in the US. And if you had an infinite budget, you couldn't start enough medical schools to train enough, have enough professors to teach enough students to have the same doctor-patient ratio. Once you have a problem like that, you start looking at creative solutions. And I started evolving that thesis. It was the three-page blog I wrote in 2011, December 2011. Then carried the thesis through. About 4 years ago or 5 years ago, I turned it into a 100-page document that is fairly well known on the web. It was called 20% Doctor Included. By the way, it's called 20% Doctor Included because when I said we don't need 80% of what doctors do, doctors objected. But when I said 20% Doctor Included, doctors loved it. This is the level of where the median doctor is in the world today. So it was a 100-page document, but it started with a 3-page blog. And I said, what can AI do? What can't it do? How will it evolve? I defined 7 stages, how it might change every 3 or 4 years across 7 or 8 generations. That's a 30-year plan. And it turned into this 100-page document, which I actually still buy. And it's about 4 or 5 years old now. But it's fully referenced. And I started from knowing nothing about medicine, not having ever worked in medicine. Very similarly, I started that 10 years ago. I published it probably 5 years ago. Then about 5 years ago, I started looking at other parts of global infrastructure. The way I looked at the future, about 700 million people, about 10% of the world's population, has a very rich lifestyle. Rich, I mean, we have air conditioning, we have good cars, we have good education, we have good medical services, good entertainment access. So we have very rich lifestyle, rich in energy, rich in almost all these aspects. If 7 billion people want it, then we can't do it the same way we've done it in the past. So I asked myself the question, can you reinvent GDP, starting with US GDP, in a very different way? And I was shocked to learn that even by myself, sitting at my ranch, thinking about it, I came up with a way to invent all parts of GDP. I thought I'd find 1 or 2 parts of GDP that were ripe for innovation through technology, where the gains, 5% gains or 10% gains are just not interesting. And that's the incremental work big companies live in, and they do their thing. What about 100% or 1,000%? You had to have tenfold efficiency improvement if 7 billion people had the same rich lifestyle 700 million people have. And that tenfold only can happen through technology. And that's when I wrote this 50-page document saying, how would I work on reinventing all parts of technology, all parts of the GDP? And I was surprised how plausible it seemed, which has led me to really fun, interesting startups and areas to pursue at this point. We're probably the only ones doing commercial 3D printed whole buildings. We're the only ones doing Mach 5 aircraft. The range is so large. We just invested in, or almost invested in, a startup doing public transit. which people say is not amenable to startups. Well, my answer to everybody is everything's amenable. Construction is, food is. People thought food wasn't amenable to startup and technology. Every part of everything is open to this kind of innovation.
Wow. No, that's amazing, Vinod. And what's the paper
But I'm
called?
an optimist. You have to be an optimist to believe this. Some people, look, any of these things, there's always a reason why you can't do it. And I always look at it as how can you overcome those problems? Not that they don't exist. And I'd rather try and fail than fail to try.
Got it.
Which is what
So-
99% of the people do.
Right. What is the name of this paper on the reinventing the GDP, Vinod, that people might
So
want to get?
it's called Reinventing Societal Infrastructure with Technology.
Okay.
I wrote it about 2 years ago. I put it on Medium.
Yep.
My big medical thesis, 20% doctor included, should be on our website as there's short forms of it, but then there's a 110-page PDF. I should have made it a book, but
Yeah.
I write these for myself, not for others. And they gradually evolve from an initial feeling to, so they're never written for other people. They're written for myself.
Yeah.
To educate myself. But that's how I educate myself. And frankly, look, at 65, I have more exciting things to work on than I've ever had to work on. So I'm very, very clear. Health is the only thing that's health permitting. This is what I'm doing for the next 20 years.
Oh, that's awesome, Vinod. So tell me, in the COVID era now, what, there's some tactical things. What are you looking at today's environment around COVID and the post-COVID opportunities? What's on your mind?
Well, so there's a lot of opportunities. Let's start with COVID itself. And instead of taking time here, I'll give you some examples. About 2 months ago, in Medium, I wrote a blog called How Khosla Ventures Entrepreneurs Have Pivoted Their Companies to Work on COVID because such a large societal problem. There's about 15 companies that have changed what they were doing in the last 2 months to go after major COVID problems. I'll give you some very, very fun examples. We had a company called OpenTrons that was doing robotics for laboratories. They built an 8-robot configuration to do PCR COVID tests. For $100,000, you can do 2,500 tests a day capacity instantaneously, and you don't have to train people to do the test because it's completely automated. So they essentially built a configuration, and they shipped like 60 such configurations to Spain or in other parts of the world. That's more than 100,000 tests a day that they sort of added as PCR capacity. We have another company that has come up with antibody test. In fact, it's probably the most accurate sensitivity and specificity antibody test. They were working on very fancy blood biomarker technologies. They had 10,000 optical ring resonators. I can say this because many of you are technical, on a single chip, laser read through ring resonance. And they turned it into, in any blood sample, they can read multiple antibodies. And why they're accurate is because they can read more than one antibody at the same time on the same $5 chip. So using chip technology in optics and lasers to produce an antibody test. But, and this is where cross-disciplinary really helps. We have since many of us know, flattening the curve doesn't solve the problem. It solves the hospital's problem because they're not burdened with too much demand in their ICUs. But it sort of makes the problem worse. In most of us, still about 4% of the US population has had COVID, so 96% still have to have it. or have a vaccine. So one of our companies using AI technologies and gene expression, so patterns of RNA, can now predict with reasonable accuracy which patient will need hospitalization and which patients will need an ICU. So think about it. There's 20,000 genes, they're being expressed. Some complex systems pattern can predict whether you'll eventually need an ICU. If you don't, shouldn't use up a hospital bed for you. That's pretty exciting, unusual science. My favorite one is a little early. This was a company 3D printing organs like pancreas. So think about it. In a very esoteric 10-year project to build artificial organs because they're in short supply in the world. And by the way, their key technology was laser interferometry, so they could print a vessel that was microns in diameter. Like, because you need blood circulation and microcapillaries in any organ if you're going to build one in the human body. So very esoteric. Guess what they started doing about 3 months ago? They printed lymph nodes where almost all the viral response happens. So they printed human lymph nodes, infected them with the COVID virus, and said what antibodies are produced in response to a viral load. So two large advantages. One, all of the antibodies are human because the organ is a human organ from about 10 different patients. Two, this organ has no history of antibodies from 50 years of being out in the wild and having all the other antibodies from every flu virus, malaria, everything else that so it's pure response to COVID. They've identified about 300 antibodies. So gone from 3D printed organs to designing antibodies. I'm not saying this will work, but they now have one of the largest selections of antibodies to pick from and say which one will generally be applicable as a therapy. So wide range of questions and frankly, really, really exciting stuff.
Phenomenal, Vinod. Now I'm going to open it up for questions. I'm sure a lot of our Indiaspora members are jumping to ask a question. So if you could raise your hand, we can certainly get you to talk to Vinod and ask him a question. Anybody? Sanjeev or Mansi, can you see someone?
Hey, Amar, I have a question.
Oh, please, Vab. Go ahead, Vab. Yeah.
You know, it's always fascinating to hear you. Now, I can't believe it.
I knew Vab when we were working on telecom. When nobody
50 plus years ago. And Vinod always says, think high, think far, and think big. So Vinod, you know, one thing is, I'm sure is that everybody's mind on a personal level and beyond personal level is vaccine. What do you know? I know you talk to a lot of people. What is your prediction when we're going to have the vaccine?
Well, so sometimes smart people know when they don't know. The Moderna vaccine is doing fairly well in trials. Manufacturing of the Moderna vaccine is pretty expensive. So it could be $50 to manufacture, and if they have to make money, it's hard when 7 billion people need the vaccine. And it's hundreds of dollars. We actually have a company that's working on a RNA manufacturing technology if somebody comes up with a great vaccine. So we'll see. We can drop the cost of manufacturing RNA to about $1 or $2. That's a whole interesting story by itself because they're replacing agricultural pesticides with this sort of RNA manufacturing, so they can eliminate pests by spraying 4 grams of RNA per acre, only 4 grams per acre instead of spraying pesticides in large volumes. But we don't know if immunity will last. There's a lot we don't know. And frankly, anybody who says they know definitively, I think is wrong. I always say if anybody says they know which direction the stock market is going, they're definitely wrong. Some things are just not predictable, and you should be smart enough to know when you can't predict things.
Yeah, Vinod, I made some investments with Mayo Clinic, and last few years have spent some time talking to some experts, and especially now. You're absolutely right. Nobody really, if they're intellectually honest, they will say nobody knows.
Yeah. What's encouraging is there's so many efforts, all improbable. But as I always say, most people assume improbables are unimportant. I always say improbables are the only thing that's important. We just don't know which improbable is important. So what's most encouraging is not what we know about Moderna or Oxford. Both of them look interesting at this stage, but the fact that there's 100 such efforts, and one of them is very likely to be successful.
Oh.
But the fundamental notion that we know whether this vaccination will last a long time or whether it'll last 3 months or lifetime. Measles vaccines last a lifetime. Flu vaccines barely last a season. Where does COVID fall? It's inherent in the characteristics of COVID. Not something we can engineer differently.
Good point, Vinod. We have a question from Seema Chaturvedi. Seema, can you unmute yourself? We'll unmute you and ask the question, please.
Yeah, thanks, MR. Vinod, this is beyond fascinating and such a pleasure. I didn't know you were a military brat too, so good to meet you in that role as well.
Grew up my whole life in Delhi in the cantonments around the country.
Dhalakua as well. Thank you.
Dhalakua as well.
Vinod, so I had the good fortune of meeting you back many years ago, but moving now, your views are very fascinating. Specific to what we are facing here and now, and we began the conversation with Black Lives Matter, in an era where a lot of opportunities are now really becoming more digital than in person. How do we get these economic opportunities to the marginalized minorities specifically when they can't even get affordable access to internet? And you've done phenomenal work, and you talked about your work with Mount Yunus. There's sad poverty levels right here in our backyard. So how do we bridge that gap in an effective manner?
Well, look, there's not an easy solution. These are very hard problems. So we shouldn't assume this is easy. I also don't think this is a problem that gets solved in a year, in a day, in a year, in a decade. Unfortunately, as human beings, we set into patterns. The highest levels of racism are seen in white males over the age of 50. In fact, we have a voting project to impact called American Bridge to mostly influence white males over the age of 50 in 3 or 4 states on the election front, because that's Trump's constituency. I'm sure some people are Trump fans, but I have no respect for Trump fans anymore. I don't think you can be ethical and a Trump fan. I'm very clear on that. Ethics and Trump support don't go together. But leaving politics aside, I think this is long-term And we have to start by changing our own biases. That's why I started by saying, I'd suggest people read the book Anti-Racist. You know, when you say you're not racist, you're actually being racist is the argument in this book. It's a fascinating book because you're trying to live by dominant white standards, as the book says, trying to be evaluated on those metrics. When you do a SAT test, you're evaluating those metrics that were engineered for that. So we have to start by asking very fundamental questions. I don't think the notion of equality is enough to solve that problem. We have to be proactively against inequality, not just for equality. There's a big difference between that statement. So we have to start by having people be conscious. And I think the last month has seen many more people get conscious. Any book on racism is out of stock on Amazon. That's a pretty good sign, but that people are trying to learn. Now, and then you just have to work at it. You know, like there's no magical solution. I do think all of us will be much more sensitized. Obviously, police brutality and the BLM issues really turn young Black kids into a certain mindset that has to be broken when they're 3 and 5, when they see their parents, their brothers, their siblings being treated a certain way. I think it has to start at that stage and then be fair all along the way. And then provide them more hard. One of the things the book says is, if you're 15 and a Black youth and you have do something bad, you're treated very differently. Your default assumed to be bad. If you're a white kid, 15, and do the same thing, people look to help you overcome that and not do it again. There's not an assumption about where you are. Now, these kinds of biases don't change very easily, but I do think generational change happens. And so I'm optimistic the kids who are in their teens and 20s today will be very, very different kids because of the protests. So it'll take 20 years to sort of have that increased sensitivity. We will get more polarized too. So I'm not sure I have an easy answer for you.
But
Thanks, Vinod. We have Priya raising her hand. Priya, could you ask your question, please?
I can unmute myself. I was waiting for the host.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ammar, for the treat this morning. I'm so energized. Vinod, so excited to hear your speak. I've not interacted with you personally, but this is our first time, but I've known your son since he started his elderly tech startup, which was like 4 years ago. I mean, I think he's thinking far ahead of his time, and I've been a part of that early stage ecosystem for quite some time. With that said, I've done quite a few webinars on the COVID and impact of COVID with leaders around the globe. One of the things I would love to hear your thoughts on, what is the impact of like global impact on valuation, especially the early stage? Because given that folks, almost like 80% of the folks are not investing in new opportunities, though as you highlighted, there are new opportunities that folks should be thinking about at this moment that could be disruptors for years. So how do you think that valuation is going to play a part in people investing in new opportunities?
So, you know, valuations is a particular thing. It's a series of it's an aggregation of a series of opinions. The bad news is most people have no idea where things will settle out, and so they are being cautious. The good news is you only need one investor to believe in you and what you're doing. That's the good news, right? Um, so, I, I look at the range of things I've seen. I was talking to some people at Founders Fund. They said they're not investing at all. They're waiting to see where valuations settle out. So when a sophisticated investor like Founders Fund had no idea where things will settle out, and they're being appropriately cautious. On our fund, we've actually made 4 or 5 investments in the last 3 months. So we haven't either slowed down or accelerated. I'd say the pace is about the same. Maybe slightly slower, mostly because it's hard to meet entrepreneurs face to face. But by and large, I think certain areas will do well. So then it becomes stronger teams are getting funding at good valuations even today. The less complete or less exciting teams are really getting much lower priority, I should say, in evaluation of opportunities. There's also a huge separation by area. Obviously, things related to COVID are getting accelerated. Things related to at-home entertainment, whether it's esports or media kinds of remote media plays, they're getting accelerated and getting a lot of interest. I think fundamentally there will be a shift. I think one of the most important shifts will be there will be less dependence. There'll always be dependence, but less dependence on supply chains from China. Whether it's for pharmaceuticals or manufacturing or other things, I think COVID has gotten mixed up with US-China relationships. But I do think the supply chain will invert and manufacturing will get more local, maybe even hyper-local. So we're seeing a lot of interest in robotics and AI because of that, because that's a way to make up for giving up on cheap labor in China. So it depends on the area.
Great. Thanks, Vinod. We have Vaibhav Parekh online. Vaibhav, can you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, MR. Hi, Vinod. Vinod, when we last met in Bangalore at Khosla Labs with Shrikant on blockchain, when you visited India for blockchain, and you were very gung-ho about blockchain solving a lot of problems. And I was just thinking both the BLM or in post-COVID, where trust is eroding and the transparency is becoming more important. What are your thoughts on blockchain trying to solve some of this problem? Do you think this is going to give impetus to the blockchain in trying to resolve some of the social issues?
So I have not generally been bullish on blockchain in the past. I would say its use in certain areas makes sense, but by and large, it's used for illegal activity, and I think that's a huge problem. So if you combine the blockchain with the traditional financial system, you start to see more opportunity in blockchain. So in supply chains where you're trying to ensure the quality of a drug made in India or China or Costa Rica, and it's not diluted or adulterated or other things like that, the blockchain is very useful. Financial speculation has been one that I always felt will set the blockchain back. But what COVID has done is asked the question, with so much spending by governments all over the world, is blockchain as a store of value, as a substitute for gold, a good idea? And I think that's possible. So we will start to see Bitcoin treated like gold as a store of value. So there's many uses of blockchain. Speculation has been one, exporting money out of countries like China or Venezuela or Argentina has been a big use of the blockchain, which would make sense. If you're in Venezuela, you don't want to hold Venezuelan currency. You want to put it on the blockchain and export it electronically and have it sit somewhere else outside the country. Same is true of China. But those, to me, are extrajudicial uses of the blockchain. But blockchain and gold are two things that if we start to think of inflationary environments because of all the spending will become potentially more important.
Thanks, Vinod. I know, Sanjeev, we had a couple of questions from our members in the chat box from Satish and Suchit. Do you mind asking those?
Yes, Vinod, Sanjeev here. A question from Satish Jha in the chat room. Can you foresee some technologies that can help policing become less brutal and more honest?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So what's been surprising to me and to many, many people that body cams have not made policing less brutal, right? There's probably two directions one can go and say, how do you make it less brutal? One would be if body cams actually guided you as a police officer in real time. I was actually just discussing this idea. I was hiking yesterday and talking to one of our young people, and I said, look into what you can do with a body cam that's much more real time. AI can recognize a person's posture, or are they holding a gun, which is almost always a debate. I thought they were holding a gun, and provide real-time feedback on a situation. That's one. I also think technology can play a large role in empathy training. I do think that's missing. And if you're a police officer and always dealing with mostly criminals, and you develop a set of biases, by the time you're 50, your mind's pretty ossified on how to treat the world. It's almost all bad guys that you're dealing with. So I do think there's role. I think somebody should spend more time looking at, can you train the brain to be much more empathetic, which I think is possible? And two, can you help people assess situations in real time using AI and cameras and sounds and much more realistically? First, there's much less plausible deniability if an officer says, I thought they were holding a gun, if a voice in their ear is saying that's not a gun, that situation isn't dangerous. So hopefully somebody more creative than me can come up with a solution, but I do think there's real room there and room for an interesting startup.
Great. Sanjeev, the next one, please.
Yes, actually, Rohit Menezes has a question that he would like to ask. Rohit, if you want to unmute yourself, please.
Sure. Thanks so much, Vinod. This has been sort of a masterclass on the breadth that you were talking about at the very beginning. It's awe-inspiring to see how broad you can go and how deep you can go at the same time. That sort of leads me back to sort of something you started off with.
By the way, this is why I recommend that book, Range. Why breadth matters more than depth.
Yeah. I wrote it down, trust me, as well as a couple of other books that you mentioned. I'm actually curious to start off where you started about your 20-year plan. It strikes me that you've got an interesting way to think about your personal development, and I suspect you have an interesting way to think about your accountability related to that professional and personal development. So I'm wondering if there's any reflections you can share in that category? It's less technical than some of the earlier questions, but I'm just curious how you might respond.
Well, so I'm not sure what you mean by accountability. Just clarify your question a little bit.
Sure. Could tell us a little bit about your 20-year plan, and then how do you hold yourself accountable to living into that plan?
Well, to be honest, I wrote it up like what are the things I want to work on, but there's not a particular sequence. These are areas I'm learning more about, reading more about. Like if I didn't think of public transit as a major problem, I looked at 3 or 4 things that I thought about. I said, you know, your average car is 2,000 pounds of steel per passenger. That's a problem. So if you have a 200-pound passenger, you're taking 2,000 pounds of steel to carry them. By the way, the same is true on average ridership in large trains too. If you look at their capacity factor throughout the day when they're running. And I said, hey, how can you use back to this 10x less steel to get 7 billion people the same richness? The answer is actually simpler than you think. There's 2 ways to do it. One, if you reduce 2,000 pounds of steel to 200 pounds of steel, you need 10x less steel in transportation. The way to do that is make cars that don't crash, which is an AI problem. Also, if you go from 12,000 miles a year, which is typical in the US, to 120,000 miles, there's another factor of 10x. So could we find a way to use 100x less steel in transportation? I find it easy to imagine how to do it. So you just start with little snippets, like a problem like, well, steel and mining are a bad thing for the planet, and 10 times more steel is going to be really bad for sustainability. So what can we do about it? Just asking a lot of the smart questions is what really, really matters. Then how do you hold yourself to it? None of these are static areas. You know, I'm not going to do all these areas of GDP myself, but I talk to a lot of people when I visit universities. I'll go talk to the right professors, and then see if there's entrepreneurs in the area who can spend 100% of their time on one of these problems. Then and go deep, and then I partner with them, and that's sort of more like I spend my time on the things that are fun, and these are all fun things. So accountability is actually a little bit easy for me because I'm always exploring these areas and asking a lot of fundamental questions. You know, when General Motors says electric cars aren't possible, I always say, why? Why aren't they possible? By the way, there's another very good book called Start With Why that I highly recommend to people, whether it's your life, your product, your company. It's the first question to ask. So that, in some sense, is accountability. Also, to make sure, you know, the biggest checks on my accountability, am I working on the right things, is my kids. I always talk to them and they'll always say, hey, why are you investing in that startup or this? If I'm not working on something I can defend, that's a pretty good test.
Yeah, great. One last question here, Vinod, before we conclude, is from Satish Jha. Satish, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, Amar. Hi, Vinod. When I look at education, my mind goes to India and Africa. I know the challenges for the 90% in the US as well, but I also think of telecom solution, how we found solution in telecom. Cell phone made possible something which couldn't imagine solving in 100 years. have you come across, since you are one of the few people who thinks about larger issues, how do we find a cell phone equivalent of education solutions? Something like cell phone in solving quality education problem, not just education problem.
Well, here's sort of my view of it. First, most of these things, you don't learn how to do it till you start trying to do it. You learn incrementally, you do something, you find a problem, you solve it, you do the next thing. So iterative solutions are much, much superior and easier to come by than having a grand 20-year plan. The second thing I'd say is a number of technologies have to come together to enable innovation in a new area. The cell phone is an important medium for education because it's fairly broadly accessible, not perfectly, but pretty broadly accessible. And computing has become very cheap. Take education. What do you need for education? You need accessibility to the internet. The cell phones enable that. You need lots of free content. That's what almost all high school content, 6th through 12th grade content, is available essentially for free now if you look. That's what my wife works on, ck12.org. But there's a missing resource. The week after I wrote my blog called Do We Need Doctors, I actually wrote a blog in 2011, early 2012, called Do We Need Teachers? Because you can hand wave your way into saying we need quality teachers, but I think that's a mistake. That's like wishing a solution. You can't have quality teachers. You know, most rural teachers in India have 2 jobs. Their attendance rate is only like 50% or 60% in rural India. You can't ask them to give up their other job, which they need to feed their family. So what can you do? I actually think AI tutors, which is the next big thing I want the CK12 to work on that I've been pushing. If you had a personal tutor 24/7 available to every child to explore whatever direction is of interest to them, I think we would solve the education problem. And I think that's doable in the next 5 years. Now, we won't do it because people don't yet believe it. You know, if you look at the Gates Foundation, they're spending their time trying to improve the quality of teachers. Well, we don't have enough teachers, let alone high quality teachers, and I don't think we'll get there. It's very much like the physician problem. Will we have enough doctors to have every poor person in India have a physician available to them 24/7 as a primary care physician? No, we won't. It's not possible. It's not even possible in a rich country like the US. So we have to look for radically different solutions. And so an AI tutor, because all the content is now available. All the lesson plans for teachers, all that. So my view is letting an average teacher or a below average teacher get guidance from an AI to personalize instruction, because the AI does 80% of the interaction, 90% of the interaction. You can multiply the number of teachers today by 10x in effectiveness and personalized education, and improve the quality of that education and tailor it to what a child is interested in, or because of AI. So the intersection of AI, open source content, and cell phones really makes me pretty optimistic that's possible.
Fantastic. Vinod, on that very positive note, we want to really thank you. It's been a fascinating 1 hour, and I think if you had time, we could go on for 2 or 3 more hours, but I know it's a Sunday, so we'll let you go. And just wanted to thank you very much for this amazing thing. You've given us so much food for thought. And also, I've got my book list for the summer as well. So thank you so much. And we will see you another time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you all very much. It's always
Bye-bye.
exciting to talk about
Thank you.
the optimistic vision.